A budget to rebuild Australia or a $1 trillion debt bomb for future generations? Welcome to Q&A. Hi there and welcome to the program. It is wonderful to be joining you live from the Canberra Theatre, and it's great to have 500 of you here in the studio audience for us tonight. Some have travelled from regional New South Wales as well, so thank you to everyone that's come from far and wide. On the panel tonight, Independent Member for Indi, Helen Haines, Minister for Superannuation and Women's Economic Security, Jane Hume, Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers, Independent Senator Jacqui Lambie, and Green Senator Larissa. Please make all of them feel welcome. Now, you can stream this live on iView and all the socials. As always, Quanda is the hashtag. Please do keep it respectful. Our first question tonight comes from Olaf Sherman.
Thanks, Hamish, and thanks, panel. Well, it's official. The Liberal Party has joined the global economic consensus. Debt and deficits don't matter. $1 trillion net debt. Who cares? Let the good times roll. It's well below the US, Japan and Europe. So what do we care? Do we care? Modern monetary theory. Let those printing presses roll. Let that helicopter money come down, dribbling down on all of us. Wonderful, that's wonderful. But to what extent are we pushing this out for the next generation to deal with? And quite frankly, there's a few of them sitting right here in front of me, and there's quite a few of them in the panel here. So I think, is that something that we should be concerned about?
Jane Hume.
Well, I think that this is definitely a pandemic budget, but it's a budget that is there to build the economy, it's to create jobs, it's to guarantee the essential services that Australians rely upon, and it's to keep Australians safe and secure. Now, last year, which was the most difficult year for so many people and for so many economies, we supported the Australian economy with $290 billion worth of economic support. And I think that using the government's fiscal strength, fiscal balance sheet, was the right thing to do. And just looking around the room tonight and seeing 500 people gathered together in a room, no masks, not a mask in sight, we must be one of the only economies that can get away with this right now. You know, the pandemic is still raging around the world. Around 800,000 cases are diagnosed every single day.
But hang on, who's getting away with it? Someone's going to pay for all of this in the end. Isn't it going to be the young people here?
But this budget is all about our next phase of our economic recovery, making sure that we grow the economy, making sure that we keep Australians safe, making sure that we guarantee the essential services. We're not out of the woods yet. We have to make sure that that economic growth that we've seen, which has been fantastic, 3% in two consecutive quarters, unemployment coming back to levels below that of prior to the pandemic. That's fantastic, but it has to be sustainable. We have to make it secure, and we have to make sure that the economy is robust enough to maintain that economic growth into the future.
Okay, it's clear that's what the government's message is. But there's a huge number of young people here tonight. We've been inundated with questions about whether young people are going to be paying off this debt. Of the young people here, who's concerned about the level of debt that we're talking about, $1 trillion ultimately? Show of hands. And could you keep your hands up if you think it's going to fall on your shoulders to pay this off? So all of you, more of you in fact. Jim Chalmers, this is a $1 trillion debt generation that's just been created. You don't have a different answer, do you?
Well, I think it does matter that we've got $1 trillion of debt in the budget. And I think what matters most is that we actually try and have something to show for all of that money that's been borrowed. My concern about the budget was that there's not enough to show for $1 trillion in debt, not enough to show for $100 billion in new spending in one night earlier on this week. I think our obligation to the young people in this audience, but to all Australians right around the country, is to spend that money wisely, particularly if it's borrowed money, to recognise that if we're going to borrow all that money, it needs to build something that lasts for you. We're right to see this budget and this moment in generational terms. We should be thinking...
Don't you also owe it to them to be honest that it will be them that pays this off?
It will be. There will be debt in the budget for generations. And there's no use sugarcoating that. debt will be with us for some time. And the obligation we have to those generations is to see it in generational terms. This is a massive moment for our country. And we can't wake up in 10 or 20 years down the track and think that all we have to show for this moment that we've been through, after everything we've been through together, and wake up and think that the only legacy of this period was that debt. We can do better than that.
I want to find Sophie Thorpe, who's in our studio audience. She's a Canberra high school student. I think you're in year 12, you're 17. What do you make of the debt levels? How do you feel about it?
I'm just really worried because, I mean, I've seen the job trainer scheme and I think it's fantastic, but I'm scared it won't be enough. And I worry for my younger cousins, I worry for my children to come as well, and me especially. Are we going to be enough in the workforce to pay it off? What's it going to come to?
In terms of the numbers that we're talking about, do you believe it will be your generation that shoulders this?
Absolutely. We're going to head it off and it's just going to keep on coming.
Sophie, can I jump in there? I left university in 1992 and I walked straight into the recession that we had to have. And at that stage, youth unemployment was so high and it actually took 10 years for the economy to recover. What we're seeing now is employment bouncing back really quickly to below levels that we saw even prior to the pandemic. That's terrific. That's really encouraging
for young
news.
people, the youth unemployment is 16.4%.
But it's coming down, which is really exciting, and we believe that by pushing unemployment lower than 5%. When I was at university, 5% unemployment was full employment. I think that's showing my age. But if we can get that unemployment levels below 4%, that'll increase wage rises, and we believe that that's the way to make sure that the economy is sustainable. Making sure that everybody that wants a job has a job. That everybody that wants to increase their hours, increase their days, can increase their hours.
Jacqui, Lambie, this is a debt generation, isn't it? I mean, for everything nice that we might be saying to Sophie right now, they've just been lumped with paying this off, haven't they?
Yeah, I'm not going to be polite about it. You're going to be paying off a debt, sweetheart. I'm not going to sit here and I don't expect these people to turn around in 10 years like they say they're going to. I just think that's really unrealistic. And first of all, what else bothers me is university fees are going up. They certainly haven't chucked any more in towards that either. I'm really concerned about a lot of you, probably not in Canberra because I've seen your house prices, they're disgusting. But, in other places where, especially in Tasmania, where these guys have been able to have their $25,000 loan from the state government and the one from the federal government, and that's given them a deposit. And right now, interest loans are sitting there. They're going to be paying them off for the next 25 years. I worry that, will that go back up? I lived through a generation where my mum and dad, I watched them when I was 12 or 13. They were working 2 jobs just to pay their 18% that their house loans had gone up to. So it really bothers me a great deal. In saying that though, look at aged care, look at the women's services that they've put out there, the childcare, things like that. This is something that should have been done a long time ago. Money should have been spent on aged care, especially. It should have started many years ago, and we would actually be saving in the long run. We are so far behind, and to generate and just continue to trickle money into these sectors when it should have been done a long time ago.
Jacqui, we will come to some of that. On this topic, where's Patrick Pygram? Could we take your question, please?
Thanks, Hamish. My name's Patrick. I'm young, male, childless, and studying at university. That makes me one of the seemingly few people who won't directly benefit from this year's big spending budget. But I'll be one of the people who'll be paying off the giant debt for decades to come. Does the panel consider the budget to be fiscally responsible? And is it fair to future generations to accrue such a huge debt with no real plan of paying it down?
Larissa, what is there isn't a plan to pay it down?
Yeah, well, thanks, Patrick and Sophie, for your questions, and the first gentleman too. It's a good time to borrow, but we should be investing in services that improve people's lives and that help us address the climate challenge. This budget gives $51 billion, that's a B, in fossil fuel subsidies to big oil, big coal and big gas over 4 years. So much of that debt is created because there's massive handouts to big corporations and they're keeping those stage 3 tax cuts which go to the very wealthy another huge proportion of the budget. So we think that investment in services is a good thing, and we think now is a good time for government to take on debt to invest in those services that improve all of our lives and could help tackle the climate crisis. But these handouts to big polluters to make the climate crisis worse, I'm worried that that's going to be the real threat to young people's lives going forward.
Helen Haines.
Patrick, Sophie and Olaf, I too am concerned about $1 trillion debt for young people, and I am concerned about what that $1 trillion debt is actually buying us. And I agree that this $1 trillion debt is not buying us solutions to climate change. There's opportunities in this budget, there were opportunities in this budget to make a game-changing choice about how we lower emissions in this country. I'm also concerned that while billions of dollars was going out the door and is going out the door, there was $0 for the Integrity Commission that was promised to us by this government at the last election. So, with $0 for an Integrity Commission and $9 billion in a fund, essentially a fund that can be used for the next election, for projects that have been approved by Cabinet but not yet announced. That's $9 billion that we don't know what that will be spent on, but we can be sure as heck there'll be a fair bit of pork barrelling that can be purchased for $9 billion. And if I was a young person, I'd be pretty concerned about that. So I hear you.
Jane Hume, why wasn't there money for an Integrity Commission?
Well, in fact, there was money for an Integrity Commission in the 2019-2020 budget.
Where
was
is
money
the
set
Integrity
aside.
Commission then?
Well, it's being consulted on right now, the Commonwealth Integrity
third
Commission, which
time.
you have rejected numerous times.
No,
the
you
reason
haven't
we
why,
haven't had a- we haven't had a
the
bill
reason
from the-
why the
passed a
Labor
bill to
Party
set one up, but
and
you
the
haven't put
Greens
yours
don't
to the
want the
Parliament.
Commonwealth Integrity Commission that's been proposed by the government is because what they would really like is to have show trials, which we've seen in the ICAC in New South Wales, which have damaged people's reputations irrevocably. We're not going to have that in a Commonwealth Parliament.
Well, we
It's
can't vote on a
unnecessary.
bill that's
All
not
it is
there,
is a
can we?
media fodder. So we've set aside money for that Commonwealth Integrity Commission, and we wait to bring it before the
Was
Parliament.
Hamish, they
EDOB
said
going to
2.5
jail? Was
years
that-
ago.
I've seen the budget papers. I looked for it carefully. $0 for salaries, $0 for an Integrity
The bill's
Commission.
in
It's not
consultation
there.
right now,
the
Helen.
Consultation has completed and it was roundly trashed by every expert in the nation. We're wondering, when will a bill actually come to the Parliament that listens to the consultation and that acts on the promise of the government? Come September 19, it will be 1,000 days since the Prime Minister promised us an Integrity Commission. We have $1 trillion of debt. We have no watchdog, no policeman on the beat to monitor this, to actually refer any problems to.
Jane Hume, would you agree, given the amount of money that is going to be spent, which many ministers have oversight of, they have the ability to choose how that money is spent and where it's spent in some cases, that actually there should be some form of Integrity Commission in place to monitor that?
Well, I saw a list of
Absolutely.
these so-called slush funds that Labor put out today, or I think, or maybe it was yesterday, and one of them fell under my portfolio, which is the digital economy strategy. Now, that's a $1.2 billion strategy to take the economy to the next level and make that great productivity leap. That's not a slush fund. That's an opportunity for businesses to grow and invest and employ and bring digitisation and productivity into their businesses. It's an opportunity to upscale and upskill existing industries like mining and construction and agriculture, and to bring in new industries like fintech and regtech and the gaming industry, and giving them a 30% refundable tax offset. You know, this is
Wasn't
not a
the
slush
question
fund.
about a
This is an
corruption
opportunity for
watchdog?
businesses to apply for grants so that they can take their businesses to the next level, and that's how we get out of debt. We grow our way out of debt. We don't tax our way out of debt.
Jim, to Jane Hume's point, are you just trashing good government programs?
No, of course not. I mean, one of the reasons why I think Australians are sceptical about these 21 slush funds is because they've seen what happened with sports rorts and dodgy land deals and safer communities rorts. They know that this government has spent as much money on advertising themselves as they have preventing domestic and family violence. They know that routinely for...
It's not true.
They know that routinely for the last 8 long years, this government creates these buckets of money. They accumulate them to use to get through an election. And this budget that was handed out on Tuesday night, the 21 slush funds, the $9 billion in secret election cash.
I'm just going to call you up on this, because are you really saying that this program Jane's talking about is an actual slush fund, or are you just being a bit hyperbolic?
No, there are 21 funds that ministers get to determine how they dole out the money. And what we've seen...
Well, that's not true either, because they're not all ministers determining it. They can be departments, they're competitive grant processes.
I'm very pleased you said that, Jane, because that's what you said about sports rorts too, with the audit, which the Auditor General found to be a disgraceful rort. And we're talking about borrowing money that some of these young people have to pay back. And some of these people have to pay back, unfortunately, money that you have borrowed to spray around to get you through elections, and that's not good enough.
All right, let's take our next question. It comes from Taylor Abraham.
Thank you. My question is, does the promotion of childcare as a woman's benefit reflect the sexist ideology of this current government?
Yes, it does.
Before I go to Jane Hume, Larissa Waters.
Yes, Taylor, it absolutely does. This government is stuck in the 1950s. They've just delivered a budget that they tried to sell us as a women's budget, but it's less than 4% of new money that was allocated on Tuesday that's for women, and half of that is childcare. They seem to think that that's only our issue. Well, again, 1950s called and they want their Prime Minister back.
Jane Hume.
Let me just take off my apron before I answer that question. The women's budget statement is not just a women's issue, and certainly childcare is not just a women's issue, but we do know that childcare disproportionately, childcare subsidies that aren't calibrated correctly disproportionately affect women, because they tend to be the second income earners. So when we recalibrated childcare and added $1.7 billion to our childcare package, it was specifically targeted at families that had second or subsequent children, because they're the ones that tend to carry the burden of the costs of childcare disproportionately. And what we found was that there is an effective marginal tax rate on that secondary earner that it actually it means that there's a disincentive to go back to work, to take on those extra days, to take on those extra hours. By recalibrating the childcare subsidy, it actually encourages more women to re-enter the workforce, to take on those extra days, to take on those extra hours. And we know that if we can increase female workforce participation by 5%, it can actually add $20 billion worth of value to GDP. So there is an economic benefit in this. This is an economic package, a women's economic package.
I think Taylor's trying to get back in. What's your response to it?
Sorry. I just think that it wasn't, I don't know. I do agree with the 1950s comment that was made.
Okay.
I just think that it was an ideology that's built in the past. I think that a lot of this is just because of everything that happened with Brittany Higgins, and that we're doing a lot to cover up and fight to repicture this woman's benefits and everything like that.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll just leave that there. Jim, would Labor in any way reshape the landscape for women in Australia? I mean, what are you actually offering that does anything more than this?
Well,
your budget and reply speech has been made tonight by the opposition leader.
Yeah, well, of course we would. I mean, one of the things about this pandemic that we're going through is it's turbocharged gender inequality in this country. And instead of recognising this as an important moment to rethink and reset and try and do something meaningful about gender inequality, the government's cobbled together this kind of patch-up job. And I think the evidence for that is that this year was the first year in 8 that the government actually could be bothered delivering a women's budget statement. They abolished it when Tony Abbott was the Minister for Women, if you can believe it, in 2014.
They were the dark times.
But Jim, I've asked what you would do differently.
This
This is not just to have another hit. What would you do differently?
Thanks, Hamish. So we would release a women's budget statement every single year. We had a discussion today about our alternative approach to the budget from a gender perspective. And one example that we would do differently, which our leader Anthony Albanese, with the input of Tanya Plibersek and Jason Clare and other colleagues, has made tonight, is to say that what we need to do is have a Housing Australia Future Fund, which builds a whole bunch of social and affordable housing and allocates 4,000 homes from that fund to women who are fleeing domestic and family violence. And so that's one example. That's one example of something we would do differently.
Jacqui, Lambie, you look a bit sceptical.
Yeah, look, I have to agree. It's been a horrific year when it comes to Liberal Party and women, and they've lost a lot of votes over it, by the way. So they're buying your vote. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
I think they're doing it on the cheap too, by the way, for all the women out there, and we've already been used on the cheap for long enough, since the 1950s, apparently. So I think for us, I can tell you now, the housing debt, there are still states out there with the housing debt. I would suggest if they need houses built, one of the first things that they do, and there are plenty of women out there that have got kids and living in the car, and I know there's men out there as well, but there's obviously a lot more women. You could get rid of those debts and do the same deal I did with Tasmania and make sure that every bit of that money is going on with new build, and every bit of money the states are putting in now stays the same and goes up with the CPI, or they can chuck on extra if they're feeling generous. I think it's about time we looked at those women that worked in aged care, cleaned our toilets, they get $20 an hour, and actually started giving them more rights. And started actually paying them for the work that they are doing and showing them a little bit more respect. So there's many things that we can do. I just want to quickly go about the childcare, because this is what really annoys me about childcare and aged care and the providers, right? Because nobody, and I notice you haven't done anything in the Liberal Party, you are not stopping those providers from putting their fees up. So what I don't want to see is us going in there, or those women going in there, and they're paying more for their childcare, and having to pay more for their childcare, and all that little bit that you've got them, having to pay more because the providers are putting up their fees. So unless there's something I'm missing here, and you can stop that from doing, the providers from doing that in aged care and childcare and across the board, what have you done to actually regulate that?
Okay. So just on the point that's being made about housing and security around that, I want to take our next question from Mel Panak, who's in our audience tonight. We'll help Mel get to her feet.
Hello, thank
What's
you
your
very
question?
much. Yes, this budget, and just as well that I'm speaking now at this juncture, this budget is said to be a woman's budget, but most women would say not really. It is just a drop, a penny in the ocean. I'm a woman in my late 50s, one of the most vulnerable in our society today. I have lived experiences of what most recently divorced women face, which is poverty, unemployment, underemployment, and then unemployment permanently, followed by homelessness. Despite being university trained, I remain unemployed, living on Job Seeker. Can you even afford a room on Job Seeker in Canberra? It's $200 on average, a room. Not possible. My question, and please, no more spin and no more patting yourselves on the back. The ball was dropped long ago by the Liberals and Labour, and now it's time to catch up. And yes, the budget is blown out, but takes money to make money, and money spent in the right areas. So I want to know, why are the most vulnerable women left out of this budget?
Before we go to the panel on that, Mel, can I just ask you, did you ever imagine finding yourself homeless?
No, not at all. I was brought here to this country by the federal government because of my qualifications. But, us women are the ones that in the past gave up our careers, followed the men's careers for our kids, looked after the kids. And we're vulnerable. Add anything else to it, such as disability, gender, diversity. And you slip even further down the ladder of vulnerability. This budget doesn't take it into consideration at all. This budget is very much for those at the top of the ladder, the haves, again. And then, if we were to look at COVID, it's a cruel equaliser. It's going to be a cruel equaliser, but it's not reflected in the budget at all. And then, us as women are going to again bear the brunt in the future when it comes to climate change and the economies of our children. What will the economy be for our children? They are going to have to pay for it.
Let's go to Helen Haines.
Yes. Mel, thank you for raising this. And when I was trawling through the budget papers, I was asking myself the same question. Where are the measures for this very vulnerable group of women, such as yourself? And I'm just appalled to hear your story, really. It is, when I see you as a woman now in your 50s facing this situation, and when I hear Taylor as a young woman at the other end of the spectrum lamenting that we're at this point for women, and when I hear that women are the secondary income earner,
Yes.
I see the structural problem that we have. So yes, we've got measures for childcare. They were called for, but women are staying at home or being the ones that are using childcare because they remain the secondary earner. They remain the ones who are out of the workforce when they're having children and not receiving superannuation during that period. And you're an example now of someone who's come to this point in your life when you're so productive still. So productive, so many skills, brought here with hope. The reality is that we wouldn't have any of the measures in this budget that we've heard this week if it weren't for women like you, women like Taylor, women all through this audience
like
and all around the nation who marched on the parliament and in their hometowns to call for some relief. But still, people like you are missing out, and we have to fix that. We do.
Jane Hume, does it surprise you when the government is spending so much money and allocating so much funding that there still seems to be so many people that feel they've missed out?
I do know that older women are a vulnerable group, and particularly because women our age didn't grow up particularly with compulsory superannuation all of their working lives, or if they did, it started off at much lower amounts. And we also took time out of the workforce to look after children. Getting divorced is never a financially helpful experience, and I speak from experience there myself. So we are a vulnerable cohort. On top of that, there are many women in our generation that are looking after elderly parents still. We're the sandwich generation. We look after grandchildren and we look after elderly parents as well. And that prevents a lot of older women from re-entering the workforce. Now, one of the things that we've done is establish the Career Revive program that helps older women get back into the workforce in regional and rural areas, and a mid-career checkpoint for women in urban areas as well. We've also abolished the 450 rule. For those people that aren't familiar with the 450 rule, it was established when superannuation began back in 1992, and it said that anybody that earns less than $450 a month doesn't need to be paid superannuation. $450 a month times 12 was $5,400, and that was the tax-free threshold back in 1992, and it hasn't changed all that time. Well, now we can change it because we've brought down fees in superannuation, particularly for low balances, and we've automated payroll systems. So it's actually now easier to pay superannuation to your employees than not pay superannuation to employees. About 300,000 people will be affected by this, but about 200,000 of them are women, and they are some of our lowest paid in society. People like aged care workers or cleaners, people that work lots of different jobs and earn smaller amounts but from different contracts. So that's a really important change. And finally, what we'd like to see is more women, particularly separated parents or single parent families, start to own their own homes. And that's why we introduced the Family Home Guarantee. That money that you're sending towards your rent, which often can be $300 or $400 or $500 a week, you're good creditors, but you can't quite get that first step in the home loan ladder. Well, from now on, you'll be able to purchase your first home, not just your first home, but re-enter the housing market with as little as a 2% deposit rather than a 20% deposit, and the government will guarantee the remaining 18%. So if I'm a single woman, a single parent family, I can buy a house in Melbourne for $600,000 with not $120,000, but $12,000.
Who's got $12,000 lying around?
Who can buy a house in Canberra?
No one can afford
on that. Jesus, come on.
Wouldn't you rather an opportunity to buy your own home rather than have to be forced to go into social housing? It's just about a leg up for those who can. Who
It will
just
be
miss out on that first
inflationary.
step in the ladder.
It will be inflationary, and you're kidding yourself if you
It's
think single parents have
10,000
got 12,000 bucks
10,000
lying
opportunities
around
over 4
when you just cut
years.
JobSeeker in half and just ended JobKeeper. To Mel, thank you so much for sharing your story. The reward for a lifetime of care for women is retirement in poverty. We have women being underpaid. The gender pay gap is still very real. We still have female-dominated workplaces paid less. And this budget doesn't tackle the structural inequality that perpetuates that. The stage 3 tax cuts, 1 year of that will give more money to men than the whole 4 years that this government has allocated to women on all issues, on childcare, on domestic violence funding. And can I say on that, there are women being turned away from shelters and from domestic violence response services because those services don't have enough funds to help everyone. This government have doubled the funding. That sounds good. But the sector says they still need 4 times as much as that to help everyone that reaches out for help. And when they can afford to give $51 billion to big fossil fuel companies in cheap diesel, they can afford to make sure that every woman and child and person that seeks help when they flee violence can get that help.
1.1 billion. Come on.
It's not enough. It's not enough.
You can't have it both ways, Larissa. We've added $1.1 billion to our women's safety package, and we've included
still not
wraparound
enough.
services for women that are fleeing situations of domestic violence, which we've never seen before. This is actually a transformational change
It is an
in how
increase,
we
but
deal
it's
with
still
domestic
not enough.
violence. And if it's still not enough, well, then we get into more debt. And these people are now telling us
Well,
that they're
don't
concerned
give the
about
handouts
debt.
to the big corporations and the billionaires. Make them pay their fair share so that we can all have the services we need.
No. That's easy. Can I just add by saying we now have the highest female participation rate in the workforce than we have ever had before at 61.8%, and the gender pay gap has come down to 13.4%, up from a high of 17% under the last Labor government.
We shouldn't have a gender pay gap at all.
All right. If any components of this conversation is raising issues for you, you can contact Beyond Blue or Lifeline on the numbers that are on your screen right now. Now, Jane mentioned the 450 rule, and we've got a question on that. It relates to superannuation. It comes from Ryan Deal.
Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm a small business owner from regional New South Wales. In 3 years, we've grown to about 30 staff, which is pretty amazing. My question is in relation to the budget. You guys have put inside your budget that anyone now that's earning around $450 a month will now get superannuation payment. I completely agree with that, and every small business that runs in New South Wales does agree with what you guys are doing. But, big but, the problem with that is that's going to affect our clients. We need to pass that expense on to other small businesses, and due to COVID-19, some small businesses can't afford to pay that superannuation. So, have you guys thought about how you plan on supporting small businesses other than giving tax write-offs, because small businesses do not want to keep purchasing equipment when we can't actually get that money back? On top of that, in your budget, you've also given a lot of money to big business. What about the small guys?
Jane Hume.
Well, actually, we've given a lot of support to small businesses. Can I go back to my portfolio in the digital economy?
No, can you answer that question, though, specifically?
Yes, but that's what I'm doing. So there's the ASBAS, which is the Australian... hang on, so I've forgotten what the acronym stands for. But it provides services to small businesses specifically. Around 17,000 small businesses will benefit from being able to a faster uptake of digital technology within their businesses by using that services. We've also still got the instant asset write-off. We've got accelerated depreciation. There are so many tax offsets and opportunities for small businesses that we've extended in this budget. So there is more opportunity. I'm really pleased to hear that you agree that those lowest paid workers deserve to have superannuation paid. I think that's terrific. I know that the Council of Australian Small Business have agreed that this is a good policy too.
Jim Chalmers, your response to the question?
Well, I agree with Jane to the extent that I think it's terrific, Ryan, that you recognise that this old $450 a month threshold doesn't really work anymore. And I think it's terrific that you want to do the best thing by those 30 workers which you employ, and thank you for employing them. Clearly, I think the best thing that we can do for small business is to make sure that we revitalise local economies. That's why JobKeeper was so important. That's why we suggested it in the first place, and we didn't want it in places like Cairns and elsewhere to be cut prematurely. We think that's part of the story. We need to have people to have disposable incomes to spend in local businesses like yours. And so that's why our priority is always, when we're talking about tax relief for small business, but also for people on low and middle incomes, so that there's that disposable income circulating in businesses like yours.
And that's exactly the policy that we've implemented.
All right, let's take our next question tonight. It comes from Steve DeLander.
Hi, I'd just like to give a shout out to my old neighbours at Howard Springs. No one had ever heard of the place when I lived there. And my question is actually on quarantine.
Yeah.
I need some help to understand why a country this vast and this wealthy has been unable to find parcels of rural land to ring fence and supply temporary outdoor accommodation such as caravans and cabins, like where we used to take our kids for Christmas and Easter, and triage out the young, fit, healthy return travellers who are unlikely to need big hospitals, are quite capable of cooking and cleaning for themselves, and will only ever need clean sheets and a feed for 2 weeks, and decent medical facilities nearby. Why haven't we done something like that by now?
Jacqui, Lambie.
Question.
Yes, this is what bothers me about the debt. If they can't do that in 12 months, I've got to ask how they're going to pay back these trillions of dollars. There's that many of them I've forgotten. But this would be a great exercise to run through. Because right now we are down in housing out there. So why can't we do two things for once? So while this epidemic is going on, why can't we move these things slightly out of the city? Why can't we put these quarantine centres, so when we finish with them, we can use them for emergency housing? Why can't we do that and make sure those bus services are going out there to pick up those people, to pick up those women, those children, make sure they're getting to the school, making sure they're getting to the service that they need to? So why can't we be doing two things at once and getting ready for that? I don't know why it's taken so long to do this, because it makes me... First of all, we could have had those 30,000 plus people, Australians, back home by now and quarantined them, or close to. That's my first thing. And why has it now taken us 15 months to get locked in a vaccine? Imagine how much better off we would have been had we had those quarantine places set up for Australians to be multi-purpose in the future, and actually had us all pretty much vaccinated by now. You know, maybe we wouldn't have needed to spend all this money and we could have got on with it.
Jim Chalmers.
Yeah, I think Jacqui's bang on when she talks about the two big issues here, quarantine, as Steve mentioned, but also the vaccinations. And if you think about, Australia's done pretty well. People have done the right thing by each other to limit the spread of the virus, and that's given us certain advantages, and the economy is beginning to recover. But what puts that at risk is getting quarantine wrong and getting the vaccinations wrong. We were surprised, Steve, frankly, that there wasn't some kind of investment in more quarantine facilities in the budget. It seems to the rest of us like a no-brainer. Clearly, we're going to need these facilities for some time now, partly because of the vaccine rollout debacle, but also because this pandemic will be with us for some time, and there will be more pandemics into the future. And so it makes a lot of sense, for some of the reasons that Jacqui mentioned a moment ago, that we should be building this kind of accommodation. Hotels are built for tourism, they're not built for quarantine. This thing has been with us for some time now. There's really no excuse for some of these facilities not to be built. The states have got some good suggestions. The Commonwealth says that they're working with them on it, but the clock's ticking.
Hamish, Steve, I've got a whole visual there of kind of a, like a wagon train of caravans out in rural Australia. But I think the point you make is such an important one around quarantine. I've heard the Prime Minister in the House all week telling us that the virus is raging all around the world, telling us that our international borders will not possibly be open until mid-next year. And we're 15 months into this virus. Every time there is a leak, it's coming from our hotel quarantines. I live in a border community, Albury-Wodonga, sitting on the Murray River there. I've seen what happens in regional Australia when there's a leak from hotel quarantine. It shuts down our economy in regional Australia. It separates people on one side of the river from the other. 168 days we had the border closed between New South Wales and Victoria. We had a health service on one side. At one point we had 125 doctors and nurses who could not come to work. We even had 2 infectious diseases doctors who were stopped at the border and could not come to work in a pandemic. So I really believe that we need to be investing in a Commonwealth-funded quarantine centre that's going to take us through at least until the middle of next year. Beyond that, really. I mean, if we can't open our international borders until the middle of next year, how are we ever going to manage this? I really believe we should be doing that. I think we know now, well, our experts tell us, we know that the virus is spread through the air, that the filtration systems in many of our hotel quarantines are still not up to it. And I'm very surprised too that there was not money in the budget to address this. So thank you for raising it.
Well, in fact, we have just invested an additional $500 million into Howard Springs, and it can now take 2,000 people. So we have, as a federal government, taken the bull by the horns on quarantine ourselves. But more importantly, and I should actually admit, Jim is right, both Victoria and Queensland have come to the federal government with proposals for additional quarantine sites.
And
of
so
course,
why
they come with
wasn't
the bill.
money-
They
why
come
wasn't
with the
money
bill.
allocated in the budget
Because they come,
to do that?
Because they come with a bill, and that's something that we'll consider. We're looking at the proposals now. But more importantly, the Prime Minister said last week, and I thought this was quite telling, if back in March last year he had have said to you that hotel quarantine was going to be 99% successful, everyone would have thought that he was over-promising. Well, in fact, that's what it's been, and then some. In fact, it's been 99.5% successful. It's one of the most successful quarantine programs anywhere in the world. And the fact that we're all here without masks, I think, suggests that it's working pretty well.
If that's the case, why does the federal government keep criticising the states for their management of it?
Well, they're getting better, but as a Victorian, Hamish, I can assure you that hotel quarantine wasn't working particularly well in Victoria for some period of time.
But either you're claiming credit for it or you're blaming them.
It's working. It's working now, but it's a system that's working now. And particularly now that everyone's got their contact tracking and tracing under control. I think New South Wales was very much the gold standard, and everybody is now taking on the systems that they have used because they know that they work. And, you know, the Sydney CBD is still full of hotel quarantine, and New South Wales government manages that very well indeed.
But there are still thousands of Australians stranded overseas, many of them in India, that want to come home.
Yes.
At 2,000 people in Howard Springs at any one time, we're talking about years potentially to get them home. You acknowledge there needs to be more than Howard Springs.
Well, and building new facilities will also take considerable periods of time. That's not going to help get those
But
Australians
hold on,
home
I mean,
from India.
but we've
Well,
heard.
you should have started a year ago.
But we've heard people that run. We've heard people that run regional airports in Queensland propose many months ago putting those things in place then, and the answer was the same then. I mean, this could go on for an indefinite period. There may be strains that we can't deal with through medication immediately. Doesn't the government actually need to do the responsible thing now and commit to more national quarantine centres? And
we're considering 2 proposals that have been proposed by 2 states right now. But in the meantime, $500 million in Howard Springs and expanding its capacity to 2,000 people.
But why is it up to
the federal government's quarantine program on top of the state's hotel quarantine program, which has worked very well indeed and continues to work well, and was part of the state's commitments that they made back in March last year.
Why is it up to them to propose it though? Why doesn't the federal government have a plan for this?
Because the states are proposing various areas. We're not identifying particular areas ourselves. We think that Howard Springs is serving Australians well.
But Jane Holton, in the review of hotel quarantine, which was released in October last year, proposed specific locations with surge capacity for instances just like this. I still don't understand why the federal government didn't respond then and put this in place back then.
We believe that Howard Springs is adequate capacity for now, that hotel quarantine continues to work, and then we'll be bringing Australians back as soon as it is safe to do so from India and from other places as well. In fact, we've repatriated hundreds of thousands of Australians already throughout 2020.
Hamish, if they'd spent less time arguing with the states about the fact that it wasn't their job to do quarantine, it was up to the states, and they just worked together and got on with it. They could have built publicly owned quarantine facilities fit for purpose. They could have started manufacturing mRNA vaccines onshore. They could then be sharing that patent technology with the world, as some other countries are now choosing to do. But they just love a Barney and they hate taking responsibility. And it's really tragic because people don't want them to argue, they just want the job done.
Is that necessarily fair, though? Because some states have actually delivered on this pretty much perfectly, while others haven't. So isn't the point Jane Hume's making fair?
I didn't really understand the point she was making, to be perfectly honest. I think it's the federal government's job to pitch in and work collaboratively with the states on quarantine. But instead, the federal government has been saying, until very recently, until Tuesday night's budget, where they are putting a little bit of dough in, they've been saying it's not their problem. But this is a national government. We're in an international pandemic. I think it's purely their responsibility, but at the very least, work with the states. Work together
That's
on
what
this
National
and fix
Cabinet's
it.
for. I know you're not part of National Cabinet, but that is in fact what National Cabinet is for, and that's where those decisions get made. And National Cabinet has worked exceptionally well. It was part of this government's $290 billion response to the pandemic that has allowed us, our economy, to get through to the other side, and has allowed us all our health to get through to the other side too.
We've got Australians stuck in India.
And we'll be bringing them back as soon as it is safe to do so.
Rather than bring them home.
That is not a decision that anybody wanted to make. It was done on the basis of health advice, which you know. And it will be,
criminalising citizens
on
is a
Sunday, the
step too
15th,
far.
it will end and we will start returning those Australian citizens home.
I think we have been quite lucky in this country right now too, and it hasn't hit us hard, and God help it if it does, because we've had 14 months or 15 months now to prepare for it, and we're still not bloody prepared. It's like we've learned absolutely nothing.
Okay, let's take our next question. It comes from Alex Chews.
Thanks, Hamish. I live in Yass, New South Wales, and commute to Canberra for work every day, some 60 kilometres each way. About 50% of my town's population do the same. I'm conscious of the carbon pollution my car puts out in the air, and I would really, really like to buy an electric vehicle. But the federal government doesn't really help. Even the United States under Donald Trump gave buyers there an equivalent of $10,000 rebate. But from the Australian government, we get no help. There was nothing about electric vehicles in the budget. Why, for God's sake, is this government's policy so poor on this?
Before I go to the panel, what do you mean handouts? You want the government to help you buy a car?
I would like a rebate because electric vehicles are much more expensive than normal petrol-powered ones.
Okay.
And that makes it a bit more affordable so we can do the right thing.
And so how much would you need from a government to make it affordable for you?
The United States funded about $7,000 US was appropriate. I think something similar would be good.
Okay, let's put that to the panel. Jim Chalmers.
Yeah. Well, Alex, yours is a fairly common story. There is a lot of appetite in Australia for electric vehicles, but one of the big deterrents is the price. And, you know, for a lot of people who want to make the switch, they can't afford to do it. And so your story is a relatively common one. We do have a policy out there about electric vehicles. We think there is a responsible way to make them a little bit cheaper, to bring them more into reach of more people so that they can take up that opportunity should they choose to do so.
What is
so
it?
there
What
are
would
two
you
ways
do?
we can do that. The first way, if you think about around a $50,000 non-luxury EV, if you cut the import tariff on that, you can make a saving of about $2,000, which we think would make a material difference. So our policy is to cut the import tariff.
That's nowhere near than the 7 to 10 grand that he wants.
Yeah, understood, but that's our policy. We think we could make a $2,000 saving on a car like that. For fringe benefits tax, we want to cut the fringe benefits tax on EVs as well when your employer provides a car, and some of you may be in that position. That would make about a $9,000 difference to the car. So, you know, clearly we want to see more EVs. That's a start, I think. That's a good way to go about it, to make them a little bit cheaper so you can pick up that opportunity if you want to.
The Climate Council says that to achieve net zero in Australia by 2035, 75% of new car sales and 60% of new truck sales need to be electric. I mean, that policy's not going to get us there.
Well, it'll come from two directions, right? So we would like to make electric vehicles cheaper for people like Alex. but also from a manufacturing point of view. We know from the manufacturers, and this is what completely shreds that rubbish campaign that Scott Morrison ran at the last election about electric vehicles. The manufacturers want to make electric vehicles too. And the more we can get to market, the more we can get in the Australian market in particular, the more competition we can have, the price will come down. So hopefully the combination of those two things brings EVs into reach of more people.
Is that a half-hearted policy, do you think?
Look, Alex, great question. And you're out there in Yass commuting each day and you're purchasing fuel from foreign-owned fuel companies. Imagine in this country if we actually were manufacturing electric vehicles ourselves. Think of all of those rare metals that we have that we could be manufacturing into batteries. Think about the renewable energy sources that largely are coming from rural and regional Australia, that we could be actually purchasing renewable energy from Mildura rather than paying a foreign national from Malaysia. We could be getting that sunshine into renewable energy into an electric vehicle from Swan Hill as opposed to Saudi. We do need better policies from both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party on this. We need incentives to get electric vehicles in this country. I really applaud your desire to have them. They are fabulous. I think what I'm seeing in my electorate now is gradually electric vehicle charging stations. I know there's opportunities for tourism and electric vehicle racing even. There's all sorts of opportunities, but largely when I think about the very first question here tonight from our young people saying, how are we going to be shouldering $1 trillion of debt? Well, wouldn't it be brilliant if part of that $1 trillion of debt was sovereign manufacturing of electric vehicles and a reduction in our emissions because we were using electric vehicles, not traditional fuel vehicles?
Larissa Waters, you heard the Labor position on this. The question was about the government's position on electric vehicles. Labor doesn't have interim targets for carbon reductions. The government, even in the budget, wouldn't commit to a firm 2050 target. Do you think either of these parties are serious about climate change?
Spoiler alert, no, I don't. We need policies that are based on science. And sadly today, as I was sitting in the Senate, I moved an amendment to a funding scheme for Northern Australia saying that, yes, let's invest in positive infrastructure, hospitals, schools, renewable energy, but let's not give public money to new oil, new coal and new gas. So I thought that was a fairly sensible amendment. We're in a climate crisis, as you recognise, Alex, and you want to do your bit like so many people do. And unfortunately, it broke my heart when both of the big parties voted against that. They voted to give public money, yet more public money, to new polluting industries that don't need the help and are making life harder for all of us. So I love that you want to have some support for EVs. Our party supports that. We saw a big road spend in the budget. Nothing for electric vehicles, nothing for charging stations, nothing for those super fast charging stations. Support the idea to remove those import tariffs. We'd like to see free registration for about 3 years for people that can afford to buy an EV, and the more that do, the price will come down. But the government fleet is enormous. We should be having electric vehicles at all levels of government as that government fleet buy.
Jacqui, Lambie.
First of all, they are expensive, and we're worrying about the fiscal and our kids owning heaps of money. That they've got new cars as it is in the government, so change that over. My second thing is I think we need to be realistic here. I mean, I come from Tasmania, come from a rural and regional area. We're still running around in Taranas and Datsun 120Ys back in Tasmania. So to ask those people to lay out 70 or 80,000 is never going to happen. We're trying to do everything we can. We're 100% renewable down there, and that's fantastic. But I think we need to be realistic. It's great that you have that sort of money at your age. Many of them don't because of circumstance. I think we need to be really realistic. We are doing the charging stations down there, but honestly, as much as I'm worried about where we're going with our climate and what is happening and everything else, I think there are bigger things on the issue than electric cars, and bigger things that we can make a much bigger difference with in quicker time than just worrying about electric cars. And once again, it is the cost, and let's be realistic about that.
Jacqui's going home. Jacqui's going home in a Datsun tonight, apparently. Let's take our next question. It comes from Paul Nyo.
Right. Thank you, Hamish. So my question is kind of built on to the previous question, and I'm kind of speaking on behalf of, not on behalf of, just
You're speaking
reflecting
on
the
behalf of
sentiment.
yourself.
Sorry?
You're speaking on behalf of yourself.
Well, and also reflect the sentiment of my colleagues and a lot of my students, because I work at a university, of the state of our university sector. So the question is, so we're talking about having this budget, and of course the accompanying debt, promising to build Australian capacity and competitiveness on the international stage. And, but one of the main pillars of our economy, which is our universities, just don't get the support in the budget.
They got cut.
Yeah, and as a result, for the past couple of years, the rankings have fallen precipitously. I'm in the sector, I know how painful it can be. While our partners around the world and our competitors, we don't have to mention who they are, they invested heavily in theirs, and you can see how that's reflected in their capacity and the outcome. So overall, how can the panel explain this short-sightedness towards a sector that is vital to Australia's international presence, strategic interests, and most importantly for a lot of people in this room, their future, the future of our young people.
That's a really good question. You are right. Our universities are a fundamental pillar of our economy, and they are so much, we rely on them for those future technologies and those future inventions, and also our skills, of course. And last year we invested around $20.3 billion in our universities, and that was record funding. And that included $1 billion that went specifically for research, and another $500 million that went for short and new courses to cope with the COVID pandemic and bring us around to the other side. And in fact, we heard a lot of the universities saying that was inadequate funding and that they weren't going to be able to make ends meet. Well, just two universities from my home state of Victoria, Monash made a surplus of around $276 billion last year. And $206 million. Don't get my millions and billions mixed up. And Melbourne University was around $176 million. So they're doing pretty well. What I think is most important now in our universities is how do we take the bright minds and the great ideas and bring them to commercialisation? How do we encourage people not to publish, which is the tradition of universities, but to patent? And that's one of the reasons why we've introduced the patent box, which is an opportunity for those really exciting ideas. I went to see one the other day. There was a company called Sear in Melbourne that came out of Melbourne University, and it's invented wearable devices to identify when people are due to have an epileptic
we are running
seizure.
out of time. I want to get to the
really
others on the panel. Jim, the unis are flush with cash, according to Jane Hume.
Not exactly. I mean, a lot of universities have taken a big hit because of what's happening with international students. There's been something like 17,000 jobs lost as a consequence of universities not being able to access the JobKeeper payment. So some universities are doing it tough. And I think it beggars belief at a time like this where we've got almost 2 million Australians either unemployed or underemployed, and people are thinking about what the future might hold for them. It beggars belief that we want to put more obstacles in people's way to going to university, making it harder and less accessible and more costly for people to go to university. It's hard enough in communities like the one I represent in Logan City in Queensland and Jacqui's community. And I want to commend Jacqui for the speech she gave about dreaming a little cheaper. I encourage you to check that out because that captures really how I feel about this. It's hard enough to get people to believe in some communities that university, if they want to go there, that there's a place for them at university. And so jacking up the fees and loading people up with debt, that is an obstacle to opportunity, and we should be trying to remove those obstacles rather than putting more in people's way.
Can I just... we actually had record enrolment in university this year. Around 800,000 people are now in universities. And not only that, but we've seen more people enrol in those STEM subjects, whether it be science or IT or engineering. They're up by more than 10% each. So that means that job-ready graduate program is working.
Speaking of 10%, that's the amount that higher education got cut from it in Tuesday night's budget.
That's not true.
It is true.
That's not true.
But you'll notice,
that's not true,
you'll notice
Larissa.
that the government found many billions to give to private schools that actually already had enough rowing sheds. So it's a question of priorities.
I'm going to go to...
That wasn't true. I'm sorry, that's not true.
A
There was an
quick
extra
response.
$1.5 billion, which I explained, that was given to
cuts in the budget,
universities last year specifically to cope with COVID. That has been removed, but funding for universities has consistently gone up every year.
You
year
have
on year.
cut it since you've been in government.
That's not
every
true.
year.
Every
in fact,
year it has
sadly,
gone
the
up.
previous government made cuts as well. The
Jacqui,
tertiary
Lambie, a
sector
final
has been
thought,
cut for
please.
years.
Yeah, so I don't want you kids to worry about paying your $1 trillion of debt off. That's under control. While you're doing that, you can pay your university off as well. And then if you put yourself into a housing debt, you better pray to God that those interest rates don't go up too much in the next 5 to 10 years. You got it, mate.
All right. On that positive note, that is all we've got time for tonight. Would you please thank our fantastic panel this evening, Helen Haines, Jane Hume, Jim Chalmers, Jacqui Lambie and Larissa Waters.
Well done, everybody.
They were awesome. You were awesome too. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions tonight. Next week, we're in Sydney. Joining me on the panel then, actor and comedian Luke McGregor, with lots of opinions apparently, politicians Barnaby Joyce and Tony Burke, and economist Gabriella D'Souza. We'll see you then. Good night.